Ready? We can turn off the fan if you want. So we'll begin. Thank you for coming this evening. Let's take a moment just to set our minds into this kind of sacred space. Whatever worldly activities we've been doing throughout the day, we set them aside and recognize that we're coming together today to study the Dharma, practice the teachings of the Buddha. So that's a sacred practice. And so we'll start by setting a strong motivation that we've come together to study these teachings, to study this practice, not just to benefit our lives, but so that we might benefit all sentient beings. We recognize that right now, our ability to help others in thought and action is limited. And the best way to help others is to perfect our minds, to become Buddhas, so we have the greatest capacity to be of service. So we study and we practice, not for our own happiness alone, but so that we might develop the techniques and the wisdom and the means to be of greater service to other sentient beings, to free them all from suffering. And so we set that strong motivation for our study this evening. We'll begin with some prayers on page 34 of the Gold Book to help us set our motivation, to help us make our practice virtuous in the beginning. So we'll recite the refuge and generating bodhicitta prayer 3 times in Tibetan and then once in English. And we'll do the 4 immeasurables in English 3 times, and then the 7 limb prayer in English. And then we'll move to page 73 to do the praise Shakyamuni after that. You know, this prayer, it says composed by Atisha, this 4-line refuge and bodhicitta prayer. We recite it all the time, right? But do we think about it when we recite it? Just because we say the words in whatever language, English, Tibetan, Hindi, doesn't matter, just saying the words, right? Because the refuge and the mind of bodhicitta is in our heart. So being able to recite all these prayers is helpful. And you can get some merit just for reciting prayers, right? But the most important part is that these prayers become ways to transform our minds. So when you recite a prayer, whatever the language, if it's a beautiful melody or a difficult melody, whether the chant master is very melodious or doesn't know any pitches at all, regardless, the prayer and the expression of it is really an opportunity and a mean for you to tame your mind and to point your mind in a certain direction. And so think of refuge, what it means to go for refuge for the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. We've all taken refuge vows. We all identify as people who are Buddhist. And so what does it mean to go for refuge? What does it mean to take refuge? And when you say that in this prayer, in these very short lines, and then when you say, I'm dedicating my practice for all sentient beings, what does that mean? Are you really letting your mind move in that direction? Or are these just mere words? So as we do preliminary prayers, and even dedication prayers at the end, really let your mind be focused on the meaning of those prayers. Let those prayers really reside in your heart, regardless of what comes out of your lips. Sangye chiran soki shonam la chancho paru damdi kapsu chi dagi jin sogi te sonam gi drolam pincher sangye jupacho sangye chiran soki shonam la chancho paru damdi kapsu chi dagi jin sogi te sonam gi Drola pinche sangue drill partial sangue shiran soki shonan la Tanchu bardu dagni kyasushi Dagi jin sogi pesonam gi Drola pinche sangue drill partial. I go for refuge into enlightenment, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. May all sentient beings be free from. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Reverently, I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginning this time, and rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain unto the end of cyclic existence, and turn the wheel of Dharma to living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of all others to the great enlightenment. And now I'll offer praise to Shakyamuni Buddha, which is on page 73 in this book. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you were born on this earth, you paced out 7 strides and then said, I am supreme in this world. To you who are wise then, I prostrate. With pure bodies, forms supremely pure, wisdom ocean-like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, Lord, to you I prostrate. With the supreme signs, face like spotless moon, color like gold, to you I prostrate. Dust free like you, the 3 worlds are not, incomparably wise one, to you I prostrate. The Savior, having great compassion, the Founder, having all understanding, the field of merit with qualities like a vast ocean, to you, the one gone to thusness, I prostrate. The purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one from the lower realms, the one path, the sublime pure reality, to the Dharma that pacifies, I prostrate. Those who are liberated and who also show the path to liberation, the holy field qualified with realizations, who are devoted to the moral precepts, to you, the sublime community intending virtue, I prostrate. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all 3 ever devout homage, to all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms, atoms, and all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous action, perform only perfect virtuous actions, subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all seeing, subdue the flow of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the ways of aging, sickness, and death. And so, lastly, I thought we'd just recite the 3 principal aspects of the path, since that's what we'll be studying today. So you could have a copy. Homage to the most venerable teachers. I shall explain here to the best of my ability the essential points of all the scriptures of the conqueror, the path acclaimed by all excellent bodhisattvas, the gateway for the fortunate ones aspiring for liberation. Those who are not attached to the joys of cyclic existence, who strive to make meaningful this life of leisure and opportunity, and who place their trust in the path that pleases the conquerors. O fortunate ones, listen with an open heart. With pure renunciation, there is no means to pacify the yearnings for the joys and fruits of samsaric ocean. Without pure renunciation, there is no means to pacify the yearning for the joys and fruits of samsaric ocean. And as craving for existence chain us thoroughly, at first search for true renunciation. But cultivating in mind that this human life is so hard to find, yet has no time to spare, preoccupations with this life will cease. By contemplating repeatedly the truth of karma and samsaric suffering, preoccupations with the next life will come to cease. As you habituate in this way, and when not even an instant of admiration arises for the prosperities of cyclic existence, and when the thought aspiring for liberation arises day and night, at this point, true renunciation has arisen. Such renunciation, too, if it is not sustained by pure awakening mind, will not become a cause of the perfect bliss of unexcelled enlightenment. Therefore, O intelligent ones, generate the excellent awakening mind. They're being swept away constantly by 4 powerful rivers. They're bound tightly with fetters of karma most difficult to escape. They're trapped inside the iron mesh of self-grasping. They're enveloped from everywhere by thick mists of ignorance. They take birth within cyclic existence that has no end. When they're endlessly tormented by the 3 sufferings, by reflecting on all your mothers who suffer such conditions, please generate the supreme awakening mind. If you do not have the wisdom realizing the ultimate nature, even if you gain familiarity with renunciation and awakening mind, you will not be able to cut the root of samsaric existence. So strive in the means of realizing dependent origination. When, with respect to all phenomena of samsara and nirvana, you see that cause and effects never deceive their laws, and when you have dismantled the focus of objectification, at that point you have entered the path that pleases the Buddhas. So long as the 2 understandings of appearance, which is undeceiving dependent origination, and emptiness devoid of all theses, remain separate, so long you have not realized the intent of the sage. However, at some point when, without alternation but at once, the instant you see that dependent origination is undeceiving, if the entire object of grasping and certitude is dismantled, at that point your analysis of the view has culminated. Furthermore, when appearance dispels the extreme of existence, and when emptiness dispels the extreme of non-existence, and if you understand how emptiness arises as cause and effect, you will never be captivated by views grasping at extremes. Thus, when you have understood as they are the essentials of the 3 principal aspects of the path, O son, seek solitude, and by enhancing the power of perseverance, swiftly accomplish your ultimate aspiration. Great. This is Thupten Jinpa's translation, yeah? Yeah. A little bit of a mouthful, this translation. So, in short, what are the 3 principal aspects of the path that these 14 verses cover? So what are the 3 topics? So this is the second class, right? So we went over, so Venerable Keldon was here last week, or 2 weeks ago. He did the first one in this series. Now we're going to do the remaining 2. So what are the 3? Renunciation, bodhicitta, and the wisdom realizing emptiness. Okay. So Tsongkhapa says that these 3 principal aspects are the heart of the whole path. And it's by relying on these 3 simultaneously and sequentially that we're able to achieve Buddhahood. But even though we practice them simultaneously, he teaches them sequentially, right? And so he teaches first renunciation. And so Venerable Keldon already discussed renunciation at length in the last class, in the first 5 verses. So I won't go over it extensively, but in brief we will. You know, what is renunciation? Right? What are we giving up? It's a hard word in English. It's meant in the word is the mind of definite emergence. Nejun Visampa. And renunciation is like the easiest way to translate that into English, because what does definite emergence mean, right? It's very hard to, you have to have a commentary on it. But what the idea is, it's the mind that emerges out of samsara, right? So when we say renunciation, usually that means giving up something, right? Like, I'm renouncing sugar for this month. I'm doing my best to avoid sugar like this, right? That's usually our connotation. Or I'm renouncing, I'm renouncing watching the news because it's all bad news and bad politics and it makes me unhappy. We can renounce all these things. But here what we mean is we're renouncing samsara. We're not renouncing joy or happiness. We're not renouncing the things that may bring us happiness. So some delicious dark chocolate that we were sharing before the teaching. We're not saying I'm never going to have chocolate again. No, we're renouncing being attached to the happiness that we get from consuming that thing. We're renouncing what here he translates as the prosperities of cyclic existence, but sometimes it's called the perfections of samsara. That's what we're renouncing. So we're renouncing the mind that clings to external objects as if they are the path to happiness and freedom.
Then what are the two aspects? One is clinging to the attractions of samsara, and then clinging to yourself. You're letting go of your own history, you're the me.
Well, this is how they all work together. So renunciation specifically is renouncing the perfections of samsara. But the way we do that is we look that all of our clinging to the perfections of samsara are due to the 8 worldly minds, which are 8 worldly minds, the mind seeking my own profit, my own pleasure, my own praise, my own fame, these things, and the mind trying to avoid those. And where do those 8 worldly minds come from? They come from self-grasping, grasping at self as truly existent. So ultimately, ignorance is it's the root of samsara, right? The ignorance that thinks that the mind is truly existent. But the way we work with it, since that's the most subtle thing to understand, we work at it in layers. So renunciation, we don't have an understanding of a realization of emptiness, maybe, but we know that we need to engage in this practice to be free from suffering, and all samsara is different types of suffering. So anything that we find pleasurable, the joy that most ordinary beings find is a joy that is a type of suffering, because it's not pure joy, pure happiness. It's a joy that's clinging to external objects as if they are real happiness, and that's the danger, right? So renunciation itself, it's a mind, it's an internal process. It doesn't mean give up all of your possessions and go, live in the forest or go to a monastery. That's not what renunciation means. And I've definitely met many people at monasteries who don't, at least from the outside, seem to have any minds for renunciation, because they seem like they're very attached to things, right? So the external isn't the important part, it's the internal part. So that's why you start with renunciation. And the beautiful thing Tsongkhapa does is, in this prayer, and they say this prayer, he actually received this prayer directly from Manjushri, they say. Tsongkhapa composed it, but really the inspiration for it was directly from Manjushri to Tsongkhapa, and then he put it to words. But so in these first 5 verses, where he's discussing renunciation, he actually mentions all of the objects of meditation of the small scope, right? So if we look at the long run, the sequential path to enlightenment, we start by, first guru devotion, but then after that, impermanence and death, and then after that, the perfect human rebirth, and so forth, and karma, and then the suffering of the lower realms, and so on. And we look here in verse 4, by cultivating in mind this human life is so hard to find. That's perfect human rebirth. Yet has no time to spare, impermanence and death, right? By contemplating repeatedly the truth of karma and samsara suffering. So that's karma and the sufferings of the lower realms, and then the sufferings of the upper realms. So all the long run steps are here in this one verse. And all of those are to build up to renunciation. Because renunciation is the mind that, whether it's Hinayana path or a Mahayana path, renunciation is the gateway to that path. So for those that enter as the Hinayana paths that don't develop mind of bodhicitta, they still need uncontrived renunciation, right? So all of those types of meditation on perfect human rebirth, permanence and impermanence and death and so forth, all help us develop renunciation. But Tsongkhapa says that's not enough if we want to become Buddhists. Perfect renunciation won't lead us to Buddha. And even renunciation combined with the wisdom, understanding, emptiness won't lead us to Buddha. We could become arhats and be free from the suffering of samsara, but we wouldn't become Buddhists. We'd still have to enter into the Mahayana path. And we need bodhicitta to do that. So that's why he teaches bodhicitta next. And they say traditionally there are the students who are of brighter capacity first develop an understanding of emptiness, and then they develop a mind of bodhicitta. And the students of a duller capacity, well, that's not really accurate. It's not like they're dull, but they're just duller than the other ones. First develop bodhicitta, and then develop a mind realizing emptiness. So you can do it either way. But they say even trying to develop the mind that understands emptiness, really great compassion, is the primary cause. And so here he's saying, even if you develop the mind of renunciation, next we need to develop bodhicitta, the awakening mind. So this section, these 3 verses cover bodhicitta from verses 6 through 8, and they're split into 2 sections. The first section is, what is the need for developing bodhicitta? And that's verse 6. And then verses 7 and 8 are, what is the method for developing bodhicitta? So here he says, renunciation, if it is not sustained or really conjoined with bodhicitta, it won't be a cause of the perfect bliss of unexcelled enlightenment. So what do we mean by perfect bliss, right? Perfect bliss doesn't mean like the bodily sensation of happiness or bliss. Perfect bliss means it's the bliss that has eliminated all faults and has collected all good qualities. And it's a bliss that is permanent and non-changing, and it exists only in the continuum of Buddhas. So it's a mental or emotional bliss that is not able to be shifted. So the Buddha's minds always have this bliss. It doesn't matter the external circumstances. This Buddha's mind is always blissful because it has eliminated all faults, and it has collected every possible good quality, and every possible positive characteristic. There's no contamination at all, So it's not the same as our feelings of bliss or happiness. And even the feelings of bliss and happiness that can occur to Arya beings or beings once you realize single-pointed concentration or shine, shamatha, there's a type of bliss that comes, the bliss of the mental bliss of pliancy that comes. That's a very blissful state. But even more than that is the state of bliss of a Buddha, which has no contaminated aggregates at all. And unexcelled enlightenment, right? So we can talk about the enlightenment on the lower paths. So the arhathood. So when you're able to eliminate all the defiled minds from your own continuum, as well as their seeds, but you haven't eliminated their influence. So you still have what we call the obstacles to omniscience. And only by meditating on the 3 pure grounds can you eliminate those. So you have to still enter the Mahayana path. So the lower or lesser enlightenments, really enlightenment isn't the right term for those. We call them the Hinayana liberation or Hinayana arhathood. But here he's just saying unexcelled enlightenment as a way to show there's nothing higher than the state of Buddhahood, because it is this perfected state that all of us can accomplish. And because of that, we need bodhicitta not just when we're close to Buddhahood, but we need it in the beginning and in the middle and in the end, they say. So obviously in the beginning, we develop bodhicitta as a way to actually enter in the Mahayana path. So when you've actually developed bodhicitta, then it makes it so much easier to accumulate merit, and you need that merit because we say you need 2 accumulations, one of merit and one of wisdom. And ultimately, the accumulation of merit serves as one of the primary causes for achieving the form body of the Buddha. And the accumulation of wisdom serves as one of the primary causes of achieving the Dharma body or the wisdom body of a Buddha. But even before that, before achieving Buddhahood, when you're on the Mahayana path and you've developed direct insight into the nature of reality and of emptiness, the way you go from the first path, they say there's 10 bodhisattva grounds. The way you go from one ground to the next, you don't have a new meditation on emptiness. You've already realized emptiness. But your meditation has to get deeper. And the way it gets deeper is by accumulating merit. So you engage in a meditative equipoise, right? And then when you arise from that, then you accumulate the merit that allows you to engage in a deeper meditative equipoise. So you constantly need to be accumulating merit. And bodhicitta, the mind that wishes to become a Buddha for the sake of all sentient beings, right? It's the mind that wishes to free all sentient beings from suffering and to achieve Buddhahood to that end. That's what we mean by bodhicitta, right? An awakened mind. Bodhicitta becomes like a multiplier. It makes all of your activities that much more meritorious, So when you talk about bodhicitta, they talk about in order to generate the wish to develop bodhicitta, many of the what are like the benefits of bodhicitta. And there's a whole traditional list of the 10 benefits of bodhicitta, such as it is the gateway to the Mahayana path. And when you achieve it, you will be called a son of the conquerors, and then you will outshine even the Hinayana Arhats. So there are all these 10, okay? For me, those aren't that inspiring. They might be for you. For me, what's inspiring is I look at teachers who I know in my life and also who I've seen, whether it's the Dalai Lama, or other teachers who have achieved some level of bodhicitta. Never mind that they're my teachers who I've seen as Buddhists. Never mind that. Just from the external view, you can see they have some taste of bodhicitta. And you see how joyful their minds are. And you see how everything they do is working for others and how that brings them joy, right? Even when there's difficult and suffering. And so that, for me, is inspiring. So I look to my teachers, and not even just my teachers, other people who even, other practitioners who I know who have been meditating, who maybe they don't actually have real bodhicitta, but they have some taste of it, right? Some flavor. And I see how that makes their minds peaceful all the time. That's inspiring. So I don't only have to rely on these 10 most common things. So it is useful to know them, and they can be beneficial to your practice. But just looking at other examples in your life of teachers who have some level of meditative stability, some level of compassion and bodhicitta, and I realize how transformative it is when I see their inspiration, So for me, that's really motivating. So we need to learn how to develop bodhicitta, this mind that wishes to achieve Buddhahood for the sake of all other sentient beings. And so what is bodhicitta? There's a very technical definition. We say it's a primary mental consciousness that has within its that it occurs simultaneous with a mental factor that is an aspiration to achieve Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. So within bodhicitta, it has one's own goal in mind of becoming a Buddha, but the primary goal is doing that for the sake of other sentient beings. So here when he says, "Oh, intelligent ones, generate the excellent awakening mind," what it means by intelligent ones are those who aren't seeking their own benefit alone, but are seeking others' benefit or others' aims. So you need, bodhicitta does contain our own benefit, right? It's becoming Buddhas is for our own benefit. Randun, they say. But we're doing it for the sake of others. For the purpose of eliminating the suffering of all sentient beings, may I become a Buddha. Not because I want to be free of samsara. Not because I don't want to suffer. So the wish for me to be free from suffering, that is what we say is only for my own benefit, or my own aims, my own goals. But if I'm doing this for the purpose of others, that's what makes it a bodhicitta mountain. So bodhicitta is very difficult to actually develop, right? It takes a lot of time, a lot of practice, a lot of meditation. And when you have actual bodhicitta, it's uncontrived, which means it doesn't take any effort. It's once you've achieved real bodhicitta, it's very difficult for it to ever disappear again. So once you achieve actual bodhicitta, then you enter the Mahayana path. And the first path is the path of accumulation. And once you move to the second part of the path of accumulation, then you can no longer, your bodhicitta cannot degenerate. So there is a brief moment when you have actual bodhicitta that it can degenerate. It's possible. But once you move on to the middling path of accumulation, it's never possible. And it's always there. If it's not manifest, so if you're in meditative equipoise, then it is latent, But no matter what, even when you're sleeping, no matter what you're doing, your bodhicitta is effortlessly always part of your mental continuum. So for us, we seem like that's a real far way away, right? So we work on it and we develop like a contrived bodhicitta, or what looks like bodhicitta. So the bodhicitta we develop at first, it's very temporary. And it's only when we're working really hard to try to develop that mind, But that's fine. That's how we get there. So once we first start with compassion, and once we make our compassion strong enough to encompass all sentient beings, and that compassion becomes easier and easier and doesn't require effort. And that compassion serves as the substantial cause to bodhicitta. And when you can actually develop some sort of bodhicitta while you're meditating, but then when you're not meditating, it kind of goes away. That's referred to as bodhicitta. That's like the skin or the bark of a sugarcane plant. So they say, if you look at a sugarcane, the sweetness is in the center, right? That's where the actual pith is. But the bark has some sweetness because it's close to the center. So if you were to eat the bark, you'll get some flavor, but it's not the real sweetness. So in the same way, if you can develop a mind of bodhicitta that exists when you're strongly meditating, and then when you stop meditating, it goes away. That's like, it's very similar to bodhicitta. It's like touching bodhicitta. That's why it's the flavor of bodhicitta. And that's a huge step forward for us. So we need to constantly practice to develop bodhicitta. And that starts with developing compassion. And so there are a number of steps we can go about to develop bodhicitta. And in the next two verses, he mentions them. But what's useful to know, just because it comes up a lot, is how we divide bodhicitta. So you'll hear the terms conventional bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta. And to become Buddha, you need to develop the two bodhicittas. So this is a little bit of a misnomer. That's not true. It's not a misnomer. It's confusing. Ultimate bodhicitta is not bodhicitta at all. Ultimate bodhicitta is a mind that directly realizes emptiness in the continuum of a bodhisattva, of an Arya bodhisattva. So it's called bodhicitta, but it's actually the mind realizing emptiness. That's ultimate bodhicitta. And conventional bodhicitta is whenever we discuss bodhicitta, what we're really talking about is conventional bodhicitta. And so when they say you need to have the mind that combines the two bodhicittas, that's what they're saying. The mind that realizes emptiness directly along with the mind of bodhicitta. Then conventional bodhicitta, we can divide into two as well. One is aspiring bodhicitta, and one is engaged bodhicitta. And what this means in the mind of an actual bodhisattva and what it means in the mind of a practitioner like us is a little bit different. So in a bodhisattva who has actually achieved bodhicitta, engaged bodhicitta is bodhicitta that is directly conjoined with a practice of the six perfections. And so what it means to be directly conjoined means that it is manifest in the mind at the same time as a practice of the six perfections is manifest in the mind, that they're simultaneously manifest. And so what that means for bodhisattvas is when they're in meditative equipoise on emptiness, when you're in meditative equipoise, the only mind you have manifest is that meditative equipoise. So even though they have bodhicitta at that point, it's not engaged bodhicitta because it's not manifest. So when you're in meditative equipoise, a bodhisattva would have what's called wishing bodhicitta or aspirational bodhicitta. But then when they're not in meditative equipoise, then all their minds of bodhicitta are simultaneously manifest along with a practice of the six perfections. So that becomes engaged bodhicitta. So that's what it means for an actual bodhisattva. For us, we can think of engaged bodhicitta and aspirational bodhicitta being like the wish to do something and then actually doing it. So it can be as simple as The thought, I'm really thirsty, I should be drinking some water right now, would be an aspirational type of bodhicitta, or the equivalent, versus actually taking up the cup and drinking it, right? So if we want to think of benefiting others, even though we don't have real bodhicitta, we have the approximation of it. Just the wish I was helping others, is an aspirational thought. But then actually doing the work to benefit others, whether that means meditating and taming our own mind, or whether it means doing things in the world and doing physical actions, whichever one of those it is, that is an engaged activity of bodhicitta. So we have to have both of those in our practice. Even before we develop actual bodhicitta, we develop aspirational bodhicitta in our meditation practice, and then we engage bodhicitta actions when we do more than just think about it. But we need to first develop bodhicitta. So how do we get there, right? So there's two common ways to develop bodhicitta that are taught in our lineage. And one is made manifest by, or most explicitly taught by Asanga, Arya Asanga, and that's called the 7-point cause and effect meditation. And the next one is called equalizing and exchanging self and others, and we say that was taught by Shantideva, though it was made explicit by, especially by, like, we say Geshe Chekwa is one of the ones that made it most explicit. He was one of the Kadampa Geshes. So these are the two methods. And now Atisha learned both these methods from his teacher, Sirlingpa, and he brought them both with him to Tibet. But he didn't teach them both publicly. So Asanga's method, he taught publicly. He thought that was appropriate for all audiences. The method of 7-point cause and effect. The method for exchanging self and others, he only taught very select audiences. And so they say that lineage went from him to Drumtompa, and then Drumtompa taught it to Geshe Potawa, and Geshe Potawa taught it to Geshe Sharawa and to Geshe Lamritampa. And then Geshe Chekawa learned from Geshe Sharawa, and he's the one that made it more explicit, because he realized at that time that it was important for these teachings that the audience and the general public was ready to receive them in a more wide way. And that one, it includes really strong lojong practices of exchanging self and others, of practicing Tonglen and things like this, which is why Atisha didn't think it was appropriate at that time. So it took a few generations of students before it was decided it was appropriate to teach. And then what we see is in their teaching, they actually combine bits of both methods. And so what Tsongkhapa did, in his Lamrim especially, is he said, here's a way to combine these two, and he systematized it. So he wasn't the first one to do that, but he made it very clear, like, this is taking these two methods and putting them together. So what I thought we'd do is go over those. We'll go over these verses first, and then we'll go over those methods briefly before we continue. So the 7-point cause and effect method. Start with that. The reason it's called that, there's two ways to understand it. So there are 7 steps, obviously, in it. The first one is recognizing that all sentient beings are your mother. They're not like your mother, they are your mother. Not necessarily in this life, obviously. In this life, we have one mother. But if we understand karma, and we understand what it means for future and past lives, then we can meditate on that and realize that if I have been born in samsara over and over again since the beginning of this time, that every other sentient being at some point has been my mother. So in this life, we don't have the karma of being mother and child, but in a past life, we have had that relationship. It's definite. So sometimes they say this is the hardest step to realize. Once you do, the other steps are much easier. So the first one is recognizing that all sentient beings are our mother. Then the second step is remembering the kindness of our mothers. And so these days, a lot of people have difficulty with this step because, especially in the West, a lot of people have like difficult relationships with their parents, right? And they say, well, my mother is mean to me and I haven't spoken to her in 20 years. And so this comes up quite a lot. When we say, well, that's even more reason to practice this. You know? But even if we have difficulties with our mothers, they say that we can understand at least 4 ways that our mothers were greatly kind to us. And the first one is that our mothers experienced the pains and difficulties of pregnancy, and in so doing, they became the conditions for us to have this perfect human rebirth. So our mothers didn't give us this perfect human body, right? That was due to our own karma. But they allowed our body to be born into this world. So this great kindness they offered us is that they allowed us to experience perfect human rebirth. Our mother gave us that. And then our mothers also protected us from harm. So think of an infant. How if you leave an infant alone for a short period of time, they die very easily, right? They can't take care of themselves in any way. So our mothers took care of us when we were young and protected us from all the dangers of samsara as best they could, and they gave us the means to have happiness in samsara, whether that was just food, clothing, education, any of these they gave us. Then in addition, we say that our mothers taught us how to live in the world. So what it means to be a good person, not necessarily in a spiritual way, but just what it means to live in the world. Our mothers gave us this teaching. What it means to be part of society. What it means to go to school, to go get a job, to have friends, to have family. Our mothers taught us this. And then they say our mothers also, traditionally, one of the great kindness of our mothers is that they would do anything to benefit us. Even if it means accumulating negative karma. So even if they had to do something harmful to their own, karma collection, they do it for us. So mothers would steal food to make sure their children weren't hungry and so forth. And so we may not have had those experiences with our mother in this life, but if we think back throughout countless lifetimes, we've definitely had those experiences. And we can see in the world that it's common for mothers to relate to their children in that way. And it's common for fathers too, as well, right? This isn't saying mothers are more important than fathers, but we use this example because we say, in general, in mammals, since mothers actually have the children in their womb for 9 to 10 months, there's just a level of connection between a mother and child that's more natural and quicker than there is between a child and a father, or a child and someone else. That's not to say that they can't have the same relationship. It's just easier for someone who has carried you in the womb. That's all. It comes more quickly and more naturally. That's the only reason we use this example. But for some people, they find it more helpful to think of other examples, and that's okay. But this is the traditional one for that reason. So we think of all the ways our mother has been kind, not just in this life, but in all of our past lives. And when I can look at every other sentient being and realize they are my mother, they have sacrificed their life for my happiness. They have gone out of their way to make sure I was fed, that I had clothing, that I had food, that I had medicine. Right? Every sentient being has done that for me over and over and over again. When you really think of that, then what's the next step is you develop a strong wish to repay their kindness. Je Khor famously composed the root verses of mind training, and a commentary on it by Geshe Se Chulbua. He talks about this step. He says you really need to meditate on this until tears are streaming from your face when you realize how kind your mother said that in this and in all past lives. This can't be just like an intellectual practice. It needs to be a deeply emotional practice that really softens your mind. Because from there, you develop the wish to repay that kindness. When you see how incredibly kind our mothers have been to us, then we can't help but develop the wish to repay that kindness. I recently did a teaching, kind of a 6-week teaching just on bodhicitta for a center in America. And one of the attendees said, I've had a difficult relationship with my mother in this life. And for me to develop compassion, I find it easier to think of all sentient beings as my child. Because if they've been my mother in past lives, surely I've been their mother in past lives too. And for me, it's more natural to develop compassion towards my child. So that's easier for me. And that's another method that is taught. The difference, though, is that the reason they don't advise that or teach that as this primary method is not only do we want to have compassion, we want to feel compelled to move forward and to engage in action based on that. And so recognizing that they have done so much for us pushes us or propels us forward in a way, So it is useful for some people to realize that all sentient beings have been my child in a past life. And if that allows you to generate more compassion, then great. That's a very helpful meditation for some people. But part of this 7-step process is wanting to compel us to engage in action. So wanting that wish to repay their kindness is quite important. So not just that they've been kind to us, but we need to repay that. And so they say from that, that's the 3rd step. From that, we have the 4th step, which is generating love, or great love, which is the wish for other sentient beings to be happy, have all the causes of happiness. And then from there, great compassion. So wishing for all sentient beings to be free from suffering and all the causes of suffering. So those two are like two sides of the same coin. And they're generally taught that we work on love first, not because love is actually a direct cause for compassion, but because it's easier to wish for happiness than it is to think of taking away suffering in general. So that's why love is usually meditated on first, and then compassion second. And then, so that's the 4th and the 5th step. The 6th step, once you've developed great compassion, you develop what's called sometimes it's called the special attitude. Sometimes it's called universal altruism. It's very difficult. There's no good way to translate it in English. The term in Tibetan is plak sum. Plak means like extra or great, and sum just means mind, right? So like the special mental attitude. But what this is saying, so we have, at this point, we've developed compassion, right? The wish for others to be free from suffering. We say laksam, or laksam ninje. Ninje is compassion. Laksam ninje is not only do I wish for all sentient beings to be free from suffering, but that it is my responsibility to actually free them from suffering. So it is recognizing that responsibility and actually holding that responsibility. It is my responsibility. So it's taking compassion and turning up the dial a little more, right? Saying not only do I want them to be free from suffering, I will free them from suffering. And then the result is bodhicitta. So that's the 7th step. So one way we can look at those 7 are 6 causes that lead to the result of bodhicitta. So that's one way. Recognizing all sentient beings have been our mother, remembering the kindness of our mother in this and all past lives, developing the wish to want to repay their kindness, and then from there developing great love and great compassion, and then the universal altruistic attitude, and then those 6 have the result of bodhicitta. The other way to look at them is, instead of looking at bodhicitta as the focus, look at compassion as the focus. And the first ones are the causes of compassion, and everything that comes after that are the results of compassion. So in his Lamrim Chenmo, the Great Stages for the Path to Enlightenment, Tsongkhapa mentioned this is another way to study those 7 steps, to realize that the first 3 are causes for compassion, and love is not necessarily a direct cause, but it's commensurate with compassion. And then the altruistic attitude and bodhicitta are results of compassion. So there's 2 ways to think of it, but in either case, the steps are the same. So that came from Arya Sangha, and we can see how powerful it is. And when we practice in our meditation, you can meditate on just one of those steps. You don't have to do all 7. And then when you have become familiar with one, then you move on to the next one. And then in your meditation, you can maybe go through, say today I want to focus on repaying the kindness of my mother. I'll first quickly meditate on recognizing all sentient beings as my mother for just a few minutes, and then thinking of their kindness for a few minutes. And then the bulk of my meditation I might spend on that 3rd step. And then I'll do the other steps very quickly. And then once I've done that for some time, I'll continue in a different practice to move, So that way you have time meditating on each of them. You don't have to always say 5 minutes, and it doesn't have to be like that all the time. 5 minutes for one, 5 minutes for 2, 5 minutes for the next. No, you have to make it natural part of your practice. So sometimes you may focus on one part more than another. That's okay. So the other method, so first we can see these verses here, verses 7 and 8, are all reflecting on the sufferings our mothers experience, right? So that is how Tsongkhapa is saying the method for developing bodhicitta. It starts with recognizing all sentient beings have been our mother, and developing, by reflecting on that, developing the wish to free them. So he spends, of these 2 verses, the first 6 lines are talking about the sufferings that our mothers experience. Then the 7th line recognizes that those sufferings are on our mothers, and then all the other steps of the practice he condenses, generate the supreme awakening mind, right? So he condenses all that into these verses. So the first one is, they're swept away constantly by 4 powerful rivers. So what that means, we say the 4 powerful rivers that he's referencing. There's the 4 causal rivers and the 4 resultant rivers. It's metaphor. The 4 causal rivers is the river of desire, and then the river of view or wrong view, the river of rebirth or samsara, and the river of ignorance. So these 4 rivers are constantly, they're swept away, right? So what that means is they don't have any control. So this is the causal rivers. The resultant rivers are birth, old age, sickness, and death, right? So those are the results of being swept away. So when we talk about being born over and over again in samsara, right? We say it's by the power of karma and delusion, right? And so the power of karma and delusion are those 4 causal rivers. And so when you're swept away, you don't have any control. You have no independence at all. You can't control your limbs. If you've seen an animal or a human caught in a raging river, you see they have no control, right? They're flailing just to try to keep their head above water. So we say that's what it's like for us in samsara. And not just for us, for all sentient beings who are our mother. Okay. And so what are the resultant 4 rivers? They continue to be born in samsara over and over again. Due to karma and delusion, which is to say the 4 rivers of desire, wrong view, birth, and ignorance. Due to those 4, you have birth, aging, sickness, and death in samsara. They're swept away, they have no control. They're bound, and then the next line makes it more clear. They're bound tightly with the fetters of karma, which are most difficult to escape. So karma, so even though they're in this river, if we continue the analogy, not only are they in this river, but their legs and their hands are bound together. So they can't even have the freedom to swim to the shore because their own karma has tied them into a knot. So they have no freedom at all to free themselves. And what is the cause of this? What is making up their chains, their karma? It's their self-grasping. So they're trapped in the iron mesh of self-grasping. So self-grasping isn't the same as self-cherishing. Self-grasping is the root of all samsara. It's grasping at the self as being truly existent, as being permanent, as being inherently existent. It's the ultimate ignorance that is the root of all samsara. So this is what is serving as the chains, as the metal in the links that cause them to create negative karma again and again. And that negative karma ties them in a knot, so even though they're in this river, they can't swim to the shore. And they're enveloped by the thick mist of ignorance. So this is the same as self-grasping, but it's saying not only is this self-grasping, tying their hands and feet together, but they've covered everywhere with mist, so you can't even see where you're going. So even if they had some way to swim to shore, they don't know where shore is because they can't see due to their own ignorance. So they've taken birth over and over again in samsara. And they're tormented by the 3 sufferings. The suffering of change, and the suffering of all dependent phenomena, right? So the suffering of suffering is that coarse suffering of sickness and aging that we all experience, even animals experience, that we want to be free from. More subtle than that is the suffering of change, which is the recognition that most of the things we describe as happiness in samsara are actually a type of suffering. They're exchanging one type of suffering for another. So when I'm hungry and I eat a delicious meal, the happiness I get from that meal is just switching from the suffering of being full to the suffering of being hungry to the suffering of being full. But because I don't realize that, I label that as happiness. I label that chocolate cake as happiness, and I grasp to it. So the suffering of change, I think, is the most difficult one. The most subtle one is the suffering of all compounded phenomena. And what that means is, as long as we exist with these contaminated aggregates, we have the capacity to suffer. And that mere capacity for us to suffer is itself a type of suffering. That's the most subtle, the most difficult to get rid of. But for me, it's important to understand that. And that is These last two sufferings are uncommon. Other religious traditions don't recognize them the way Buddhists do. So they're both very important. But for me, in my life, thinking of the suffering of change was most useful. Because if I think of all compounded suffering, I say, okay, the fact that I have this body made of contaminated agates mean I can suffer, okay. But until I become an arhat or achieve the realization of emptiness, I'm still going to have this body, right? So I can't do much immediately about it. It can't really affect me too much. But when I think of the suffering of change, so many things that I think of as happiness are really a type of suffering. It doesn't say don't enjoy them, but it says change the way you enjoy them and realize them for what they are. When it's an incredibly hot day and you jump into the stream of cold water or a lake and you experience that happiness of escaping the heat, the suffering of heat, all you've done is experience the suffering of cold. That doesn't mean you haven't escaped the suffering of heat, right? It doesn't mean you can't rejoice in that moment that you're not experiencing the suffering of heat. But it means that this suffering of cold isn't real happiness. It's just changing one condition for another condition. So don't grasp onto it as being the cause of happiness. Just recognize that due to the shifting nature of samsara, I'm not experiencing suffering in such a coarse way as I was a moment before. So I can be joyful for that. But this cold lake or this delicious meal or whatever it is isn't happiness. It's just changing one for another. So I can't only search for this because this won't free me. This is samsara stuff. So we see that our mothers, all sentient beings, are tied up by their own self-grasping, the chains of their own self-grasping, which causes them to create karma that binds their hands and their feet. And they're in this rushing river of delusion, of attachment, of ignorance. And they're clouded, their vision is clouded by the mists of ignorance, so they can't even see where they're going. So when we see all of our mothers' sufferings, how can we not want to free them from suffering? That's what they ask us. When you see these mothers who've been so kind to us over and over again in samsara, and you see their suffering, they say, how heartless must I be to want to free myself from suffering, but leave them to suffering in samsara. Only a beast would be so heartless to seek their own liberation from suffering while I see my mothers suffering so greatly. So that's his practice of building bodhicitta. So that's what he's referencing in these verses. So they say that the way of exchanging self and others, you equalize yourself and others. And so what that does, well, first I should say in the 7 points, in general, these days, especially in Tsongkhapa's tradition, we say we start with developing equanimity. Now, very clearly, like Je Tsongkhapa, he says that's not necessary. He says there's 2 lineages, one that start with equanimity and one that doesn't. So he teaches the one that doesn't start with equanimity. And I'm referencing his commentary on the 7-point mind training, which is found in the great book of mind training. It's translated by Thupten Jumbo. Very, very wonderful, wonderful text. But we tend to start with equanimity. That's Tsongkhapa's advice. So what equanimity is recognizing that all sentient beings are the same and wanting to be free from suffering and wanting to have happiness. So we might look at sentient beings and due to our attachment and desire, we give them the label of friend. And then we might look at other sentient beings and due to our anger or hatred, we give them the label of enemy. Then there are other sentient beings who, due to our ignorance, we don't have any relationship with them, so we give them the label of stranger. And then based on these labels, we treat them differently. Right? We want our friends and our family and those ones we care about to have happiness. And those enemies, we want them only to have bad things. We don't care about them. And then the strangers, we're indifferent to those. So first we have to realize, just because I give them this label in this life, that label is projected by my own mind. It doesn't mean anything. So all sentient beings are the same in wanting to be free from suffering. And they're all the same in deserving my working for their benefit. Right? So this label, a friend, enemy, or stranger, is arbitrary. It's something I've invented due to the meager circumstances of this life only. And so because of that, we equalize and we say there's no difference between those I label friend, enemy, or stranger. And so we start with meditations, developing an equanimity that recognizes that all sentient beings are equal in deserving my love and my compassion and deserving my effort to free them from samsara. And then we go through the steps. Equalizing is a little bit different. Equalizing is saying not only are all sentient beings the same in wanting happiness and deserving happiness, they're the same as me. So instead of equalizing all sentient beings to each other, we equalize them to ourselves. And we say, in the same way that I want happiness, so do all the sentient beings. But my happiness isn't more important than other sentient beings' happiness. It's the same. In fact, since I'm only one being and other sentient beings are numberless, their happiness is actually more important than my happiness. So we equalize self and other in that way. And then, from equalizing, we think of the disadvantages of self-cherishing mind and how it only causes problems in this life. And then we think of the advantages of the mind that cherishes others and how that can lead to happiness for self and others. And then we do what's called the actual exchange. So this isn't about exchanging bodies. This isn't about exchanging my possessions for your possessions. It's exchanging those minds. So exchanging the mind focused on my own benefit with the mind focused on others' benefit. So we exchange the self-cherishing mind for the mind that cherishes others. And then we practice what's called Tonglen, which is giving and taking. So it's a meditative practice where we visualize taking away others' suffering, and then we give all of our possessions and our love and compassion out. And we say, we let this ride on the breath. So as we breathe in the suffering of all sentient beings. And we use that suffering, we take it into our bodies, and we say, may this suffering ripen on me. And we use that suffering and that visualization to defeat our own self-cherishing mind. And then, in exchange, we give away all of our happiness, all of our possessions, all of our joy. Mentally, we give it away. So that's the practice of Tonglen, giving and taking. And then, from the practice, we develop this special attitude, the altruistic attitude. And from there, we have bodhicitta. So what Tsongkhapa said is we can combine these two. And so the first step is equanimity, as before. Develop equanimity, recognizing all sentient beings as equal. And then from there, we recognize all sentient beings as our mother. And we remember the kindness of our mother. But then we also remember the kindness sentient beings have had when they weren't our mother as well. So we say sentient beings are kind to us in many ways. In one way, we can't have any happiness in our lives if it weren't for the sentient beings. They're the causes for our happiness. Even if we think of the things that we use in our lives that bring us happiness, this is a coarse example, but like all those things were made by the sentient beings, right? So all the things that we accumulate were made by others. That's just a coarse way. Then we also could think, well, my ability to develop patience and love are based on other sentient beings. Even those who harm me, that's why I develop patience. So sentient beings are actually very kind to me. They're actually more kind to me than the Buddhas, because I can't develop patience based on a Buddha who never harms me. But I can develop patience based on sentient beings who say harmful things to me. So in that way, they're more kind to us. And my actual liberation from samsara comes from the kindness of other sentient beings. So we think of all sentient beings being our mother. We think of their kindness when they were our mothers, but also their kindness when they weren't our mothers. And then we develop the wish to repay that kindness. And then from there, we develop the mind that wishes to exchange our self-cherishing mind for the mind that cherishes others. We think of the disadvantages of self-cherishing and the advantages of cherishing others. And then we practice Tonglen and recognize that the generation of love and compassion are simultaneous with the practice of Tonglen. So when you are breathing in others' suffering, that's a practice of compassion, wanting to take away their suffering. And when you give them all of your own happiness, that's a practice of love. So love and compassion and the practice of Tonglen are combined. And then you have the altruistic attitude of bodhicitta. So that tends to be 11 steps is how they often categorize it. So I won't do more into that today because we still have one more topic to get through, another half of the prayer. But that's the general way we talk about generating bodhicitta. Very abbreviated version, right? But it's really important to think of how we can let this bodhicitta mind infiltrate our everyday life. You know, the most important thing of these three principal aspects of the path, renunciation, bodhicitta, and emptiness, is not that there are things we'll eventually develop. And then when we get closer to Buddha, we'll have these minds. What's important is we bring them into our lives right now. Whatever baby understandings we have, we bring them into our lives. And we do that first by trying to understand them, by studying them. And then we meditate on them. We try to have a critical mind that says, do I understand this? What are all the points? What are the methods? What are the meanings? So we contemplate them. And then we bring them into our meditation practice. So once we have some idea or understanding, we meditate on them. And we try to make our minds be of one flavor with renunciation and bodhicitta and wisdom. And when we can do that in meditation, even just a little bit, then we bring it into our everyday lives. If we can only have these things when we're meditating by ourselves, there's no use. But when we're out in the world at our jobs or at school or dealing with strangers in traffic, whatever it is we're doing, if we can bring some version of these minds, then that's where we see real benefit, right? And the beauty is, all these minds are benefiting us, even though our goal is to help others. The more we're able to have a mind wishing for others' happiness, we find ourselves happier. We find ourselves less stressed out. We find ourselves less easily distracted because we're working for others in this way. So we need to bring these three principal aspects of the path into our lives. It can't just be hypothetical or intellectual, you know. But so, what Tsongkhapa says, even if you have renunciation, and if you have bodhicitta, if you don't have the wisdom that realizes emptiness, you won't actually be able to get rid of all of your afflicted minds. Because the actual real antidote for the afflicted minds is the wisdom realizing emptiness. You know, so if we're moving on to the next verse, we see you can't cut the root of samsaric existence if we don't understand emptiness or dependent origination. So we can think of, you know, we talk about love and patience are two of the antidotes to anger, right? But they're only the antidotes to anger. They're not antidotes to anything else. Whereas understanding emptiness is an antidote to all of our afflicted minds. So it's like a panacea. It's much more powerful. And if we think of our attachment and our anger, both of those are based in ignorance, right? What is attachment? Attachment is our minds, our ignorant minds that are grasping at the self as truly existing, project this idea of something as being desirable on this external object. And then we cling to that idea of desirability. That's what we think of as attachment. It's our own projection onto a thing. And anger is we project this idea of something being undesirable or harmful. And because of that, we react to that projection. And that's our anger or our hatred. So those are both based in this idea that things truly exist in the way they appear to us. That things are truly established, you know? So they're based in ignorance. And even though we say those are the three root poisons, attachment, anger, and ignorance, that cause us to cycle in samsara over and over again, really the root is ignorance. That's the root of samsara. So if we meditate on emptiness, that makes all of our other meditations more powerful because it gives less space for the afflicted minds to arise. So here, the section on emptiness has 5 divisions. So this first verse is saying the reason for meditating on the view or on emptiness is what's taught in this first verse. Okay. So he's saying the reason for meditating on emptiness is because without meditating on it, you will never cut the root of samsara. So here he says you need to realize dependent origination. So we say that dependent origination, there's 2 types. There's dependent origination that's based on like cause and effect, or on compounded phenomena. And then there's dependent origination that is based upon the dependencies or recognizing the relationship between phenomena. So here we need to recognize both. So one type of dependent origination is just seeing that all causes have effects, right? So everything depends on the cause in this way. So that's easy when you're looking at impermanent phenomena. But the other type of dependent origination is by looking at the result of something, coming to the realization that it has a cause, and therefore it cannot exist by means of its own nature, and that it's related to something else in this way. is looking at it from the opposite direction. So we need both of these things. The next, I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because we're moving up on time. The next verse, after the verse 9 says, the reason for meditating on emptiness, right? But then the 10th verse says, the way of arriving at the actual view of emptiness. So here we say, with respect to all phenomena of samsara and nirvana, right? We realize that cause and effect are never deceptive. What that means is that the law of karma always is accurate, right? So that's the first step to realizing emptiness, is recognizing the validity of karma in the law of cause and effect, developing faith and confidence in this, and then from that faith and confidence and conviction, developing a mind that actually recognizes it and understands it. Because if you grasp onto something as truly existing, then the law of cause and effect wouldn't affect it, right? So when you can realize that karma really does play a role in our lives, it shakes the foundation of holding on to things as being truly existent, because it shows how they are dependent on other things. When you've dismantled the focus of your objectification, so when you are able to look at external phenomena and no longer grasp them, not just external phenomena, external phenomena as well as the eye, and no longer grasp them as truly existing, as being the way they appear to our mind. That's what it means to dismantle the object, the focus of our objectification. So our objectification is when we take something and we say that the way it appears to us is the way it really exists. That's what it means to objectify in this context. When we can dismantle that, when we can realize the way things exist and the way they appear to us are not the same, they're not concurrent, right? When we can take that apart and no longer engage in behaviors that are based only on the way things appear, but instead we engage in behaviors, both mental and physical, based on the way things actually exist. That's what it means to dismantle the objectification of phenomena. So that's how we please the Buddhists. You enter the path that pleases the Buddhists. You enter into the path that actually serves as the antidote to all of your afflictions. So then the next verse, 11, it comes under the heading of the sign that you haven't actually completed your investigation on the view of emptiness. So here it says, as long as the two understandings of appearance and emptiness remain separate, you haven't realized the intent of the sage. So we say that there's the appearing factor, and then there is the factor of emptiness, right? Everything has two phenomena, or these two factors. So the appearance factor, we say that the fact that it exists conventionally, and that it is a dependent origination and is non-deceptive. That's its appearing factor. And its emptiness factor is that it doesn't, we say the emptiness factor is that it doesn't exist the way it appears. So emptiness is, so it is a non-affirming negation that is the mere refutation of something existing truly, right? So the emptiness factor and the appearance factor we have to recognize them simultaneously. That it appears due to conventionality, everything exists conventionally, but it does not exist ultimately. So it has those two things simultaneously, right? The way the appearance factor is that it does exist conventionally. All phenomena exist conventionally by means of words and projection and ideas, but it doesn't exist ultimately by means of its own nature. So it has those two things simultaneously. And we have to recognize that those are the same thing. So when we say everything is a dependent origination and everything is empty of inherent existence, that means the same thing. But it's looking at it from two different angles, right? So we need to realize both of those things simultaneously. So that's what it means here when it says, as long as the two understandings. So the first one is of appearance, which is undeceiving, dependent origination, and the understanding of emptiness, which is that it's devoid of all theses. As long as those two remain separate, you haven't realized the intention of the Buddha. So as long as you think of independent arising and you think of emptiness as being two separate things, then you haven't realized the path of the Buddha. So you need to realize them as the same. When we say that it's devoid of all feces, what that means here is that all phenomena actually has the emptiness itself is a non-affirming negation. So what that means, so when we talk about negative phenomena or negations, you can have affirming negations and non-affirming negations. So in an affirming negation, in general, a negation is a type of phenomena that when you think about it, you automatically understand the thing that it is negating. So if I say a non-pot, right? But if you bring to mind a non-pot, you automatically have to bring to mind or understand what a pot is in order to understand what a non-pot is, right? So it's a negative phenomenon because it's negating something. It's negating a pot. But by doing so, you have to bring to mind the idea of a pot. So often, all negative phenomena works in that way. Now, a non-affirming negation, an affirming negation, once you've done that, you substitute something else in its place. So you could say a non-pot that is a compounded phenomenon. So even though you've negated it being a pot, you have substituted it being a compounded phenomenon. So that you've affirmed something in place of what you have negated, right? A non-affirming negation doesn't affirm anything, it just negates. So if you say, this is a non-pot, but I haven't put anything else in its place, so the non-existence of a pot doesn't posit anything in exchange, right? It just cuts off the existence of something existing as a pot. But if I say this is a compounded phenomena that is not a pot, that's when I've affirmed something. You see the difference?
Which one is this in the
So here, when it says emptiness devoid of feces, what that means, devoid of feces or devoid of statements, is referencing that emptiness is a non-affirming negation. So that's what that's referencing. So emptiness is the mere negation, is a non-affirming negation that merely negates true existence. So when we think of emptiness, it doesn't put forth any positive phenomena in exchange. All emptiness is, the emptiness of any phenomena is the negation of that thing as truly existing. So the fact that this water glass does not truly exist, that's its emptiness, right? But it's not saying it doesn't truly exist, but it does something else, right? It's not putting forth any positive phenomena in exchange. It's only cutting off the mere ability for it to exist permanently or truly or inherently. So in that way, we say that emptiness is a non-affirming negation. And so here, when they say emptiness devoid of all feces or statements of truth, that's highlighting the fact that emptiness itself is a non-affirming negation that merely negates existing truly. It's not positing forth anything else. And that's important because lower schools and non-Buddhist schools, when they posit emptiness, they actually posit something affirming. When they cut rid of them, when they try to cut out true existence, they posit something else in its place. So even if we look at the Swatantrika school, right? So we follow the Prasangika school, the Prasangika Madhyamaka school. If we look at the Swatantrika Madhyamaka school, so it's still one of the higher schools, led by teachers like Baba Viveka and so forth. They say, even though things don't exist truly, they still exist by means of their own characteristics. So even though they try to negate something, they have something else there in its place, which they don't see a contradiction, but we see a contradiction there, right? But what this Stein is proving is, or commenting on is, that everything has the nature of emptiness, which itself doesn't posit any positive characteristics. And at the same time, it is a dependent arising, which means that it is the result of causes and conditions, and it's dependent on other phenomena. So in the same way that something being tall is, the idea of tall is dependent on the idea of short, right? You need those two in relationship to each other. So that's not that it doesn't have a relationship of cause and effect, but it still has a relationship because it defines itself on another thing. So the idea of self is defined against the idea of other, right? So that's a type of interdependent origination. So here we're saying dependent, or the appearing of a phenomenon is its appearing factor is the fact that it is a dependent arising, and its emptiness factor is that it doesn't exist truly. So we have to see that those two things are not separate, but they're one characteristic that is looked at in two different ways. And until we can do that, until we have these separate ideas, we haven't actually understood emptiness. So the 12th verse is saying the measure or the the measure of having completely understood or completely investigated emptiness. So that is, however, at some point, without alternation, but at once, you see that dependent origination is undeceiving and that the object of grasping is dismantled. At that point, the analysis of your view is complete. So what that's saying is, when you look at a phenomenon and the appearing factor of it existing by conventional means, and of it not existing truly, when you have those two things simultaneously, but not one after the other, that's when your view of emptiness has been completed, or your understanding, not your realization of it, but at least your understanding of it. So it's not thinking, now I'm thinking this thing exists conventionally, and now I'm thinking this thing doesn't exist ultimately. It's when you're able to combine those two that you are able to say that you actually have a complete analysis. And so Tsongkhapa goes on to the next verse is positing an uncommon position of the Prasangika. So that's the chapter heading, the 5th chapter heading in emptiness. It's the uncommon position. So teaching the uncommon position of the Prasangika view. So in general, we say, when we try to understand emptiness, what we're doing is trying to defeat the two extremes, right? Of something not existing at all and something existing truly or inherently, right? So those are the two views. So we say by recognizing that something doesn't exist ultimately, that is negating in general, that is negating the extreme of existence. So we say something doesn't exist truly, therefore something that's negating true existence. And we say things do exist conventionally, so that's negating true negation, right? That's how we generally understand those things. And all the Buddhist schools that look at the idea of things not existing truly hold those two pieces, right? Because the way we negate true existence is by thinking of that nothing exists truly. And then the way we negate true negation is saying it does exist conventionally. Here he's saying that the Prasangika position is not only that, it's also that because things exist conventionally, that also it doesn't only negate their true non-existence, it negates their true existence as well. And because things don't exist ultimately, it doesn't only negate them existing ultimately, it also negates their non-existence. This is a little confusing to do in a really brief method. So think of, we don't have a lot of time left. The way we think about it is, we say, the way we negate something existing truly is by thinking that it exists conventionally. That's what we're used to saying. But, okay. If we have these two methods of proving, right? One, the appearance is that everything exists conventionally, and the other is nothing exists inherently. We have these two methods of analyzing. And generally we say one method of analyzing helps stop the thought of things existing truly, and one method of analyzing helps stop the thought of things not existing at all, right? But what the Prasangika position says is both those analyses stop both thoughts. So recognizing that things exist conventionally, you can use that rationale to stop the thought that grasps at things as truly existent, and it can also stop the thought of things not existing at all. It can defeat both views of eternalism and nihilism. And the view of things not existing inherently can stop the thought of nihilism and also stop the thought of eternalism. So generally, the other schools say that one rationale blocks one extreme. We say each of those rationales blocks both extremes. You see what I'm saying? Even if you don't, do you get the general idea, right? The idea is that we can recognize when you really understand emptiness, then you can say, because something doesn't exist conventionally, then it necessarily means it is a dependent origination that does not exist by means of its own nature. And when you think in that way, it blocks both the grasping at true existence and the grasping at non-existence. So when you are able to see those two factors, the appearing factor and the emptiness factor, as being inseparable, then no matter which way you analyze, you can block both extremes because the analyses come together. So I think all phenomena exist conventionally, and therefore it doesn't exist inherently, and therefore it doesn't not exist. All phenomena exist, does not have inherent existence. And since all phenomena does not have inherent existence, therefore it does not exist eternally, and it does not non-exist. So those two rationales, those two factors of appearing and emptiness, can block both extremes. So here, all he's teaching in this verse is when the appearance, which is to say the dependent origination, the realization that all things exist conventionally, dispels the extreme of existence. So it dispels things existing internally. And when emptiness, so the view that things don't exist by means of their own nature, dispels the extreme of non-existence. So that's the opposite of how all the other schools say. So that's the thing just to remember, is that other schools say appearance dispels non-existence and emptiness dispels existence. And here we say they both do both. So that's the uncommon Prasangika view. And when you are able to realize that emptiness and appearance are two sides of the same coin, and you don't focus on one and the other, but instead both simultaneously, then you're able to have these levels of realization. And due to that, you're not ever going to be grasping at one of the extremes. Because the intellectual practice that you're using to negate the extremes negates both extremes simultaneously. I know that's confusing. Emptiness is a difficult topic, obviously. I'm talking about it in the span of 20 minutes. So we're not going to get it. The idea of this verse is the idea of this class is to understand what he's saying first in this verse. So this verse is showing the uncommon position of the Prasangika and recognizing that we use these two views, these two aspects, the appearing aspect and the emptiness aspect. The appearing aspect we understand as dependent origination, and the emptiness aspect we understand as the non-true existence, and that these two aspects, dependent origination and emptiness, mean the same thing. And we can focus on them both to block both extremes of true existence and non-existence. And that's the uncommon Prasangika method of developing insight into the nature of all reality. And so recognizing that's what Tsongkhapa is teaching in this verse is what's important, and it recognizes and instills faith and confidence in us in the Prasangika teachings as taught by Tsongkhapa as well as other teachers as being the correct method for developing insight into emptiness and using that insight into emptiness to strengthen our bodhicitta, and through those two combined become Buddhists. Now, if you really are more interested in learning about emptiness, luckily, the next Saturday evening program we're going to be doing here is all in the Heart Sutra. And that'll probably be starting in sometime in September. We don't know yet, but that will be a 2-month program and the Heart Sutra is all about emptiness. So you're going to get emptiness out the wazoo, more than you want. So that's coming. It's in the future. I'm sorry?
Will we include the different school of thoughts?
The different tenets?
Yes.
We'll see. Yeah, I'm sure it's part of it. Anyway, the program that we're going to be doing is the Heart Sutra module, which is separate from the tenets module. But in order to understand emptiness, you do have to realize what it isn't and what it doesn't mean. And so part of that is understanding what the other schools say emptiness is. So I'm sure that'll come up 100%. I don't know the exact course outline right now, but it definitely will come up. And that's the reason, if you look at the way the monks study at the monastery, is you don't study the Prasangika view first. At the monastery, we spend 10 years before we start studying the Prasangika point of view. So the first 10 years, the first 3 years are from the Sautrantika point of view, which is one of the Hinayana schools. And then the next 7 years are mostly Swatantrika Madhyamaka, but then a little bit of Yogacharya or Kiramantra. So those two combined. And then after 7 years of that, then you start studying the Prasantika view. Because the most important thing is to understand, what are you negating? When you say the self doesn't actually exist the way it appears to us, what is that self that we're negating, as opposed to the conventional self that we actually live and believe, right? So what is that self we're negating? And if you don't understand the way the other schools negate the self, then it's very difficult to really grasp the fine details of the actual Prasantika view, right? So it's useful to study the other schools, because then when you can understand what they're positing, then the Prasantika view, which is more subtle, says why they're wrong, you have a taste of it. Otherwise, it's just like words, you know what I mean? So you need to study all those schools. So we'll go into more detail about it. The truth is, wisdom takes merit, and merit takes wisdom, right? We need compassion and bodhicitta, and we need to understand reality. We need both. They refer to as the two wings of a bird that flies across the far shore of samsara to reach nirvana and to reach Buddhahood. So we need both. But we need both because they mutually support one another. So when you develop an experience of wisdom, it makes the practice of the other perfections more profound. And so it makes your bodhicitta stronger. It makes it more powerful. Because it's no longer has any basis in this flawed perception of reality. And when you have a mind that's only wishing for the happiness of other sentient beings, and is dedicated that every action you do is for others, that makes your understanding of the nature of reality more profound, right? So the two of them work together. It's not like these two separate things that are independent, like pathways. They're two interwoven pathways. And you can have one, right? If you only have wisdom, but you don't have emptiness, if you only have wisdom but no bodhicitta, you can have direct realizations of wisdom, right? All Arya beings have direct realizations of emptiness, including the Hinayana arhats. But they don't get free, they don't achieve Buddhahood. They just get their own freedom in samsara. And eventually, they still have to overcome the imprints in their mind that cause them to see things as dualistic, that have a dualistic appearance. We say all of our sense organs, or all of our sense capacities, the five senses, are mistaken minds, because everything appears to them as if it were truly existing. So it has the appearance of true existence, even though it's not truly existing. And as long as we have the imprints that come from the ignorance that grasps that thing is truly existent, we'll always have that appearance, including Hinayana arhats. So the only way we can get rid of those imprints is by developing a realization of emptiness that is conjoined with bodhicitta on the Mahayana path. And the bodhicitta allows us to accumulate the merit that then allows our meditations on emptiness to be deeper and to become the antidote to those imprints. They say that when we think of emptiness, we think of emptiness in independent arising. We have to think of them not to have a relationship such as like a pot and a pillar that are not related at all. But we think of them as two sides of the same coin, right? So emptiness and dependent origination, the appearance factor and the emptiness factor, are two sides of the same coin. But they have to be in conjunction with bodhicitta if we really want to progress in the path. And those both find as their basis renunciation. Those both find as their basis the wish to be free from samsara and from all of the pleasures that samsara offers. Because we realize that all of the pleasures of samsara are suffering. They aren't pleasure. All of samsara's perfections are misery. And so it's important to see how these three work together and that we can incorporate them into our lives. If we're not learning how to incorporate them into our lives, then it's useless to do this study, this practice. It doesn't mean it. The last verse, which is the last of all the subjects, the subject headings, is the exhortation for single-pointed practice, right? So we have the introduction. I'm sure Venerable Kelda went over the earlier ones, right? there's three main distinctions in this text. There's like the title and the introduction to the text, and then there's the main text, and then there is the conclusion of the text. The conclusion is like the colophon that comes last. And then in the main section of the text, there are four parts. There's the section on renunciation, the section on bodhicitta, section on wisdom or the view, and then the last section, which is this last verse, which is the exhortation for single-pointed practice. So he says in here, seek solitude by enhancing the power of perseverance, accomplish your ultimate aspiration. So here, solitude means both internal solitude and external solitude. If we study how to achieve single-pointed concentration, the first advice is to give up your homeland, right? To give up your friends and family. Not because it's bad to have friends and family, but because they're sources of attachment and anger for you. And so as long as you are in the vicinity of these active sources of attachment and anger, it's very difficult to calm your mind. So to actually develop a calm mind, the advice is to abandon your homeland, which is to say, go find somewhere and go and retreat where you can create an external solitude. Once you've tamed your mind, then you develop an internal solitude that you can access no matter where you are, in the center of the busiest city, and with all friends and enemies and loved ones, everyone surrounding you all the time, you can have that internal solitude. But since we're beginners, to get there, we have to start with external solitude to give us more easy conditions, right? So here he says, seek solitude. So you're seeking the real solitude is internal solitude. But to get there, we use external solitude. That means go on retreat. That means do the practices you can to allow yourself the space to develop minds of concentration. And when we have some level of concentration, we then focus those minds on renunciation and bodhicitta and on emptiness, right? So that's why we do calm abiding meditation or simple mindfulness meditation. That's why in most meditation sessions, you start with focusing on your breath to calm your mind. Because until you've calmed your mind, it's hard to do any sort of analytical meditation. So seek isolation. He's saying seek internal isolation. Seek a calm mind. Seek a mind that is supple, that you can point towards any object and focus on. And so we do that first by seeking external solitude, and using those tools, we develop internal solitude. And then he says, enhance the power of your perseverance. So of the six perfections, the fourth one is the power of perseverance, right? We have generosity, ethics or morality, patience, and then perseverance, which and then concentration and wisdom are the last two. So perseverance is overcoming our laziness. Both are like worldly laziness, like our sloth or our torpor. It's also overcoming the laziness that is finding delight in non-dharma activity. And it's overcoming the laziness of putting ourselves down and saying, I'm not good enough to practice, right? I'm not smart enough. I don't have the skills or the ability. So perseverance is saying that samsara is filled with obstacles. It's going to make our practice difficult. And we've been born in samsara over and over again due to our own karma and delusions. So of course it's not easy. Samsara isn't easy. So we develop the perseverance that says, even though things are difficult, and even though I'm not going to see immediate results, I'm still going to engage in this practice. And that becomes like the power supply, that even when the electricity goes out, it lets you at least turn on a little reading lamp or something, We need to work on perseverance because it fuels all of our practice. And so I think of something like coming to class this evening. How incredible it is that we've come together today to study the Dharma. There are so many things we could be doing with our day today, with our time. But we took the time to come here. And so that itself is practicing perseverance. It's recognizing that there are non-Dharma things I could be doing, right? And I might have more immediately like those. And I may go to this teaching and maybe he just confuses me because he talks too much about things that don't make any sense and he talks too quickly and he is not very clear. That's possible. But I'm still committing myself to Dharma practice and study. So it takes perseverance and energy. So that's a profound thing that we've done today, just by coming together. So we can rejoice in them. And we can realize that perseverance is what allows us to keep practicing, even if the results don't come tomorrow. We have to have a relaxed attitude that says, I know the goal is Buddhahood. That's the long-term goal. We need to have an attitude that sees the big picture. And then we have to have the attitude that realizes that this is an extensive practice, right? It's a lot of pieces to go together. But those two have to be coupled with a relaxed attitude that says, I'm doing the best I can in samsara. I'm doing the best I can, which means I'm not going to become a Buddha tomorrow. I'm not going to be free from suffering tomorrow. I might be angry tomorrow, but I'm doing the best I can. And every day I'm working towards Buddhahood, one step at a time. And that is amazing. Because for so long, I've only been running away from Buddha. For so long, I've only been digging myself deeper and deeper into suffering. And so now I'm finally pointed in the right direction. And so let that rejoicing strengthen your perseverance. Because that really is the power that lets our practice continue on and on and on. And so in his last verse, that's what Tsongkhapa is reminding us. That if we want to become Buddhas, we need to put in the effort. And the effort is going to take work. It's not easy because we've done it backwards for so long. So really develop perseverance. And so all of us coming together today is actually a great example of that. And so with that, I'll finish for this evening. So I think it's really wonderful. We have a chance to teach this incredible prayer. If you are so motivated, I recommend you bring it into your practice. And if not this prayer, then even just bring into your practice meditating on renunciation, bodhicitta, and the wisdom realizing emptiness, realizing how those three aspects really form the whole path to Buddhahood, and how we need to rely on those as central meditative objects. It's really, really powerful. And so this prayer is a good reminder of that. There are other ways as well. And so in the last few moments, are there any questions we want to bring up?
Suffering of compounded phenomenon.
So there's many different ways to define suffering. So you can say there's the 6 sufferings, the 8 sufferings, and so forth. But the heart is the 3 types of suffering. And so of those 3, they go from coarse to most subtle. So the coarsest one is suffering of suffering, then the suffering of change. The most subtle is the suffering of all compounded phenomena, or all pervasive compounded suffering, it's also called. And so the easiest way to think about it is the fact that we have the capacity to suffer is itself a type of suffering. That mere capacity for suffering. And so that's often described, and when you try to eliminate it, as the contaminated aggregates that we're born with. So we say that the I is based on this projection of a self on the 5 aggregates. So the body is the form aggregate. Then we have 4 mental aggregates, right? Discrimination, awareness, volition, and feeling, right? So these are the 5 aggregates upon which we project this idea of a truly existing self. And those are all contaminated aggregates because they come about due to karma and delusion. So our inability to control where we're reborn, and we're constantly thrown into birth after birth, means those are contaminated by the afflicted minds, right? And so those all have the capacity to suffer. So until we directly realize emptiness and are able to actually eliminate all of samsara, we have the capacity to suffer. And so that mere capacity is a type of suffering. And so that's why I said for me, it's important to know that and meditate on it. But thinking about that in my everyday life isn't as useful as thinking of the suffering of change, right? So in my meditation, I try to think of all 3 because all pervasive suffering is an uncommon understanding of suffering taught by the Buddha that no other religious system teaches, right? So it's important to understand what it means. And that our capacity for suffering itself is a type of suffering. And you can see examples of it, of general malaise people have sometimes, right? And it's just like, there may not be anything going wrong in their life, right? But they still have this experience of like unhappiness. And so that isn't this exact thing, but it kind of is a reflection of that. Like there's, the absence of happiness, they're experiencing it as a suffering because they live in a contaminated aggregates that have the capacity to suffer. For me, it's in my daily life, the suffering of change is more useful to meditate on, but that's because my grasping and happiness is so strong that meditating on that suffering helps me to eliminate the grasping and happiness that's outside of myself. So for me, that's more useful. But that's not the truth for everyone. So all pervasive suffering, or the suffering of compounded phenomena, is the mere fact that we exist with contaminated aggregates, and we have the capacity to suffer. That itself is a type of suffering. Does that help?
It's more like a done deal. Of course, we have some control in the karma we create and our delusion. But in the case of suffering of change, it's more within our like control.
Yeah, the experience of suffering of change. I mean, the suffering of change itself isn't in our control, but recognizing it as suffering instead of recognizing it as happiness is in our control, right? So that's what it's something I can do about. Where in this immediate life, I can't do much about the fact that I have these contaminated aggregates, but it is still useful to meditate on them because it's a reminder of the fact that even when things feel like they're going well and my meditation is going well, and maybe my self grasping isn't so strong or my grasping at happiness isn't so overwhelming, I still have suffering, right? So it is important to meditate on all three types of suffering and realize that if I'm only trying to eliminate the first two, I'm not actually looking at the main goal, because the main suffering we need to eliminate is that most subtle one, right? So it's very important to meditate on, but in my practical everyday life, that second one I feel like I have more control over, and my attachment and my grasping is so strong that it's more helpful for me to meditate on that. And maybe once I have less attachment and grasping, then it'll become more useful to meditate on the third. Like that's a possibility, you know what I mean? So we have to see what's more useful for our practice. That's why the Buddha taught all these methods. And he says we have to, all these methods are useful, and we have to combine them all together. But depending on our circumstances, one may be more useful at this time and another more useful at a different time, you know? So we have to see what we need in our life right now. Okay, so we'll end it there. There's no more questions. We'll just finish with the dedication prayer, because we already gone over a few minutes. So on page, sorry,
We started late.
we did start late, but that's, you know, no excuse to go late. We started perfect on time, just India time. It's fine. So our dedication prayers are on page 36, and we will recite the 2 verses of dedication prayer. And then, yeah, let's do that first. 36. We'll do the first, we'll do these 2 in English. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And there's actually a way that you recite this verse, this last verse, in Tibetan you recite it often with 3 or 4 different variations. 4 if you include Tantra, but 3 if you don't. And the 3 are actually emphasizing the 3 principal aspects of the path. So the first line, Chanshup Semshop Rinpoche, is the supreme jewel of bodhicitta, right? So the first time you recite it, you say Chanshup Semshop Rinpoche. Then the second time you recite it, you say Nejum Sampa Rinpoche, and that is the mind of renunciation. And then the third time you say Toni Tawa Rinpoche, so that is the jewel of the view of emptiness. And so you recite the same verse 3 times, and it's all 3 principal aspects of the path. So I thought we'd do that now in 3 times, and the other 2 aren't written here. So after the first time, you just have to maybe listen to what I say for the first line, but the following 3 lines are the exact same. So we can recite all 3 of them together. Yanshu Sancho Rinpoche Ma Ke Panam Ke Gyorche Kyewa Nyampa Me Payam Gone Gondu Pewar So Nejung Sampa Rinpoche Ma Ke Panam Ke Gyorche Kyewa Nyampa Me Payam Gone Gondu Pewar Shok Toni Tawa Rinpoche Ma Ke Panam Ke Gyorche Kyeba Nyampa Me Payam Gone Gondu Pewar Shok. So that's just a nice way to incorporate the 3 principal aspects of the path into our dedication. And then we'll just end. Do we have the quick return prayer from Lama Zopa or no? It'd be good to just recite that as well. So we dedicate any merit we've accumulated through our practice today for all sentient beings, that all sentient beings might be free from suffering. Thank you. We recognize that by studying the teachings of the Dharma, teachings of the Buddha today, we've accumulated some merit. And so instead of having this merit ripen on ourselves, may this positive merit ripen on all sentient beings. May all sentient beings be free from suffering, from sickness, from illness, from unhappiness. May they all achieve perfect complete Buddhahood. May all those we care about who are ill have freedom from their illness and have mental happiness if they're not able to be free from their illness. May all of our teachers who are living continue to show the aspect of having long lives. May all their holy wishes be fulfilled without any obstacles or hindrance. May the FPMP organization and other organizations teaching the Holy Dharma in an authentic and genuine way continue to thrive to benefit sentient beings. And may CKSL especially continue to thrive and grow and work to become a jewel for the teachings of the Buddha here in Bangalore and in India, the land of the teachings of the Buddha. May it continue to grow and prosper and be a benefit. And so we dedicate our merit for all of those things. And we'll conclude by offering the short, long life prayer for His Holiness Dalai Lama, these 4 lines in the book, and then we'll recite the prayer for the swift rebirth of Kapti Lama Rinpoche that's composed by the Dalai Lama. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Chenrezig, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Stravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make requests. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss! Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth, the blessings of the ocean of the 3 jewels, and the great waves of bodhicitta and of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Thank you so much for coming this evening, for spending this time with me. I hope you have a great evening, and I look forward to spending more time with you in the future.
Yeah.